Hello and welcome to my show, the Natalie Noyes Podcast, where I interview business owners, entrepreneurs in their respective fields and areas of expertise. As a natural networker and connector with a passion for storytelling, I can promise you that you will walk away thinking deeper as you listen to some of my guests discuss their various journeys in business, real estate, entertainment, and more. Today I speak with Greg Noyes about his new book series for kids and young minds. He tells me about his passion for education and the importance of making philosophy concepts easier for kids to understand. Our time together was enlightening, and I hope you also find the conversation interesting. Greg, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome.
I am here with Greg today. Greg Noyes is an educator, author of a young kids book series called Think Like a Philosopher. Greg is a talented, creative man who has an amazing mind. His approach to many of his projects is focused, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to sit down with him to talk about his book series.
Is this okay for me to acknowledge at this point that I'm your husband?
If you must.
Oh, I must?
Everybody knows Greg is my husband, but let's keep this professional, Greg.
A few things before you get started on this philosophy book topic is what a pleasure to be your first guest. When we look back after your 1000th episode, I'll remember that this was the first one. What an honor.
I'm already doing the math, and I'm like, how many years, how many weeks, what is my job gonna look like?
Well, if you do one a week, that'd be 52 in a year. So it would take you to, what did I say, to 1,000?
1,000.
Take you, so in 10 years you'd be at 520, so almost 20 years. But you can do more than one a week.
Yeah, I'm kind of a go-getter. I probably will do more than 1 week. All right, so Greg, tell me a little bit about your background as an educator and how it led you to write children's books.
My background as an educator started in first grade when I said to myself, I'm going to be a first grade teacher, because at the moment I understood the first grade mind. And then I got to second grade and I changed my mind. I said, I want to be a second grade teacher because I understand the second grade mind. And I kept changing my mind all the way through college. Ended up teaching middle school. So I've taught middle school history for many years, high school history, and been an administrator in middle school as well. And just have an interest in philosophy.
So I've heard that story a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the story. I think it's great. I think if you can dream to be something and every year you just level it up, but it's the same field, it makes sense why you are an educator.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write this book series that encourages kids to think like a philosopher?
Well, not only have I had an enthusiasm for philosophy, but a lot of this stems from becoming a Christian as a 17, 18-year-old and understanding truth and wanting other people to understand truth. Because there's a, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it was often said that theology was the queen of the sciences and philosophy was her handmaiden. In other words, the study of God was the most important thing to study. And philosophy, which is the love of wisdom or studying truth, is secondary to that. So in a lot of ways, being a Christian and thinking about theology goes hand in hand with philosophy. So my thought was to try to present some of these philosophical concepts that can be really heavy and hard to understand for anyone, even me, especially me, and try to get it to where a kid could understand. So I was thinking through that lens, and having taught kids for many years, I thought I could put together a pretty cool book that would explain things and have cool pictures and so on and so forth.
So far from what I've seen from your book, I love the concept. I love the idea. I think that it's very well thought through and developed. How has it been hard? How do you take these concepts and prepare them for young kids to understand?
Yeah, the process, so I was thinking from a big picture perspective at first, and I suppose I still am, but I really wanted to take a reader through the entirety of Western philosophy from the very beginning to today. And obviously there's other philosophies around the world that are not quote unquote Western, but there's something unique about Western philosophy, starting with the Greeks. And I just broke it up into sections, and really it came down to, I could see, I had a vision for 5 groups of 5 books each, 25 books, going from the ancient Greeks to medieval philosophy to Renaissance philosophy to Enlightenment to today. And trying to pinpoint which people would need to be talked about, which people are of influence, because obviously I don't think you can make a kid's book that really covers the entirety of Western philosophy. You really got to pick and choose where's the important turning points. A big inspiration for me, there's a theologian who died a few years ago named R.C. Sproul, who had a series called The Consequences of Ideas. And I just love that idea, that there's consequences to your ideas. So you can have ideas, and that doesn't mean that it's just something intangible. It leads to how people act, and it leads to wars and all kinds of things like that. I don't know, I like art too. As you know, I like to draw, I like photography. So a big part of this was, how do you visualize these concepts? And I really just had to sit down and draw them and think, okay, what would this look like? What's a good way to explain this? Like, let's say Plato's allegory of the cave. That's something that some people are familiar with, and there's different drawings you could Google and see kind of what it looks like. But I wanted to come up with a new way to visualize it, which I did in the book on Plato.
Who's my favorite philosopher?
Your favorite philosopher is Aristotle.
Yes. I want to know what kind of system. How did you organize who you were going to talk about? Yeah, just enlighten me.
So we'll focus in on the ancient Greeks, because those are the only books that I've completed and are looking to get published at this point. Like I said, there's another 20 after that I have a vision for, but starting with the ancient Greeks, clearly there's 3 guys that stand above the rest, and so I feel like they almost needed their own book to tell their story, and that's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And as you know, one taught the other. So Socrates was the teacher of Plato the teacher of Aristotle. But the story doesn't start with Socrates, and he was such a big deal, in fact, that everyone before him is now just called a pre-Socratic. But that's an important group of people too, with Parmenides, Heraclitus, Zeno, Democritus. They had some ideas about the arche, or the essential element behind everything. And I didn't feel like any one of those guys was a big enough deal to get their own book, so I have one on the pre-Socratics. And then I had to, so the first of the 5 books, going back to the first pre-Socratic really, I had to start with Thales. Thales, there's very little written by him that has survived. Most of what we know of Thales is mentioned by later philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. They had a big respect for Thales, and he's considered the first philosopher, the first Greek philosopher. Why? Because he predicted a solar eclipse, but not just the act of doing that, but the idea that you could apply logic and reason and study patterns and come to some sort of truth. In this case, he was able to say there's going to be an eclipse today, and there was, and that was on a very specific date, at a very specific time. So his story is pretty cool. He's far lesser known than Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, but that's how I've envisioned it. The story had to start with Thales, and then go to the pre-Socratics, and then Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle.
So what is the importance of teaching philosophy to children at a young age?
So I'm going to answer that in a couple ways. One, children are hardwired for stories, and there's a way to talk about philosophy that is not telling a story, that I think is still interesting, but I think most kids would find super boring. So I had to find a way to tell this story where it was going to be appealing for younger readers.
And how are you doing that? How are you ensuring that the kids don't get bored as they read this? Like, what did you do?
There's a few ways. One is I try to introduce a little bit of humor with each one, such as Plato, for example, had this idea that kings should not rule because they might be ignorant, that people shouldn't vote for leaders like a democracy because the people might be ignorant. So why should they pick someone? He thought that philosophers should be kings, and he was half joking about that, but he was also half serious. So in the picture, I have him with a crown on his head that's too big for his head, falling over his face, and he's got his thumbs up. So humor with the images that'll be appealing, humor with the story, but also the idea of a story arc. And that was tough. I had to really think through that and almost emphasize certain things that weren't emphasized necessarily as much by the philosophers. So the idea of the arche. The arche is the essential element behind everything. Thales thought it was water. Later philosophers after him thought it was earth or wind or fire or some combination of those four or other things. Pythagoras thought maybe it was numbers, that numbers was special. Democritus and Leucippus thought it was atoms, which is pretty close to what we know now. They didn't envision the atoms that we would call atoms, but they thought everything was built with building blocks, something like cells maybe. But the point is, in telling these stories, when I got to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, I almost had to imagine what would their arche be, even though they didn't talk about the arche in the same way. So, for example, Socrates, his arche might have been asking questions, right? Questioning, or virtue, probably is a better one. His arche might be virtue. He didn't necessarily say that, but that's me putting that in his mouth as I wrote the story. Plato, his arche might be knowledge. That's what he talks about with the allegory of the cave, although he didn't really talk about that being the arche. And then Aristotle, his arche might be logic. So anyway, so you see a story arc that is a common thread throughout the books. And oddly enough, Abby, our daughter, our 12-year-old daughter, is the one
That's funny
that
that you
first
mentioned
pointed
Abby. That's so funny because I had
Yeah.
a question for you about Abby and
Something she said to you during the
You can go there.
drafting
Yeah.
process. Go ahead.
So I thought the books were coming along pretty nice, and I would read them to Abby or have her read them with me. And she's the first one to go, oh, wait, but what's the answer to this question? So we asked a lot of questions in the books, and she's reading it through the eyes of a child that wants a story. She wants a story arc. She wants some finality. She wants resolution. And that was huge because I didn't even think of it that way. I was just thinking, oh, this is a fun educational book and you'll learn some stuff. But she was looking for the story, and so I had to adjust it in that way. And that was super helpful.
You know, I think now when I go back and read your book with you and do some of the editing, you know, second reader, whatever you need, I'm definitely going to be looking more for that. So far, I've just been looking at design elements. I've been looking
Yeah, you have.
It's going to now pique my interest. In preparing these books, obviously we discussed how they are really meant for a little bit older.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're not like for little kids. So I'm excited to see what you're going to do for the younger kids, because I think we can even simplify it more. And I think those are going to be great, like board books for kids. But you're talking to like age group of what?
So when I first sat down to write it, I was thinking of Annabelle, who's our 9-year-old, and and she's a 4th grader. So I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool to explain philosophy to a 4th grader?
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of a reach. Annabelle, and the way I described it in the opening pages of the book is, this book is for everyone, in that you could read it to a little kid and I think they would still find it interesting or entertaining, but you couldn't expect a 1st through 4th grader to read that book on their own. It would definitely be for a little bit older audience. I think Abby's a perfect age, or any teenager or young adult would find the book both challenging and accessible.
Wait, you mean I could read this and learn from it?
I know you could.
Absolutely. I honestly, yeah.
For those of you listening, I have read some of it, and my mom actually got a copy of it and was like, this is really good. I'm learning stuff that I didn't think about. So when you're asking the question of who is this for, I agree. I think anybody could pick it up and be like, wow. When I think about philosophers, I think wisdom, I think knowledge, I want to think deeper on that thought or that concept, or what do you mean by that, right? Like, has our society lost the ability to think like a philosopher? Shameless plug there.
That is a great question. And I think in a lot of ways, yes, we have lost the ability to think like a philosopher. We should probably throw out the word postmodern at this point. And
What do you mean by that? What is postmodern?
so postmodern, it refers not only to a time frame, a time period, and there's not an exact date from when our world moved from modern to postmodern, but in philosophical terms, postmodern is this stage where a lot of people believe that there is no truth, that truth is relative, that morals are relative, that nothing matters. And you can really trace this line of thinking if you work backwards back to existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, and before that, people like Friedrich Nietzsche, who was an atheist, or Soren Kierkegaard, who is the other father of existentialism, who's actually a Christian. But even before then, you could trace it back to Immanuel Kant, questioning how we can really even know anything in what he called the noumenal realm. So he said, we're in the realm of phenomenon. How can you know anything about metaphysics, basically? He questioned it. And and that you might even say that's where postmodernism began, was with Kant, even though he was an Enlightenment philosopher. So a couple hundred years later, that's where we're at, where truth is relative in the eyes of a lot of people. And that, to me, seems contrary to what these ancient Greeks focused on. Certainly, Socrates would have hated that idea of relative truth. He was all about virtue and asking questions and getting to truth. Certainly, Aristotle would have thought it was nonsense. It's literally nonsense to think that truth is relative. And he's the one who first defined logic and something like the law of non-contradiction, that something cannot be both A and non-A at the same time and in the same relationship. Yet in so many ways in our culture, we break that law, and it's just supposed to be okay. So yeah, we have lost the ability to think like a philosopher today in a lot of ways, especially in the Western world.
How do you say all that to a kid? Can you summarize it and say it like you're telling a kid?
That's exactly why I wanted to write the books and have some pictures to go along with it.
All right.
Very cool, Greg. How do you see your book series impacting the way children approach problem solving and critical thinking?
I think it, more than anything, it's not like a guidebook on how to go about solving problems, but if anything, it plants seeds. And just knowing that there are people that came before us that pursued truth.
I like that.
That valued virtue, that valued knowledge, that loved wisdom, which is literally what philosopher means. So I would hope it would be an encouragement, not necessarily a how-to book on how to think critically.
I don't know why I'm going here, but I have a lot of friends that are single, okay? And when they're like, this is going to be for another podcast, but I need to throw this out there because it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think I'm going to have a talk about this with one of my friends. But there's a problem with women finding quality men. Do you think that the men out there need to learn and know some history and philosophy? What do you tell the single guys out there that are like, man, I'm out there dating, I'd really like to yeah, I mean, come on.
So you asked about history and philosophy. Let me start there. Benjamin Netanyahu, who I know is a controversial figure, but I think he's has some genius in him. He was asked about what people ought to study, and he said three things: history, history, and history. I thought that was so cool. I studied history, of course. But yeah, guys should know that. Also makes me think of is it TikTok? I'm not even on TikTok, but the latest TikTok or social media trend where women ask their guys how often they think of the Roman Empire. I think that's hilarious. And I do think about the Roman Empire quite often, but I think about a lot of history quite often.
Now to clearly,
but I didn't get to your
to clearly segue for a second here. Let's take a side note here because I like to go on these side notes. To summarize what you just said, in essence, I think the question that I asked earlier, like why is it important? I mean, taking it to modern day, right? When it comes to these relationships or people or like just who you are, like a person of character, a person of like, everybody stands for something and has a belief in something, right? Mm-hmm. So as you think about these thinkers before us and ponder and take time, it's like, I feel like it's definitely a topic of intrigue. When we're talking about making it relevant to younger kids, just like you can't really have a substantial relationship if you don't have fundamental truths or fundamental values that you both believe in. And for kids, when you talk about like we are kids and shaping their values and thoughts, we model our relationship and we model parenting for them, but ultimately they have to make their own decisions about how they're going to approach that. But it's just becoming very different, right?
Yeah, well, thinking of that and then back to your original question about what guys should do.
Yeah.
Is you need to be the type of person that you just need to focus on yourself. You need to become the right type of person if you want to attract the right type of person. Obviously, that's a really broad answer, but that's the truth. If you want to score a girl of high character, you need to be a man of high character.
High caliber.
High caliber. You're high caliber.
Thank you.
So how do you strike a balance between teaching philosophy and encouraging individual thought and creativity in kids?
That's an interesting question. In terms of these books and the philosophy involved in these books, it is a lot of just teaching what these ancient Greeks thought and the conclusions that they came to about certain topics, being and becoming, the essential elements, the quintessential element, if there was such a thing, logic and reason, and so on and so forth. And this will probably come out in later versions of later books in this series, that there is room for individual thought and your own interpretation of things as well. Looking at, again, I already mentioned these guys, but Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, the fathers of existentialism. Kierkegaard in particular, this was a point that he made, was that although there is absolute truth, he believed, there was also room for individual truth, individual experiences that were special to you that no one else could necessarily understand completely the way you do. And he thought of this a lot in terms of your relationship with God. So there are things that are uniquely personal and individual. And I think even approaching a book that's teaching philosophy or teaching anything, you're going to have certain ways that you interact with that book that's special to you.
So a lot of these philosophers, you've mentioned God and your faith a bit. A lot of these philosophers don't directly tie into faith. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, or it wasn't their focus, but I do think you can make the case that, especially with more modern philosophers, that there's really two distinct camps. There's believers and non-believers. Obviously, there's still some gray area in between, but you do see it start to divide in that way. And really the way you answer some of the ultimate questions, such as the question about God, is there God or is there not a God? The way you answer that question will determine your worldview and determine how you answer all the other questions. And you can see that especially in philosophers. You can see that in non-believers, famous non-believing, influential people, brilliant people Even in the last 100 years, 150 years, Bertrand Russell is an example of that. Sigmund Freud. Bertrand Russell was a British mathematician and philosopher. Sigmund Freud, probably the most famous psychologist in history. These people did not believe in God, and you can see the conclusions that they come to because of it. And then you have believers, say Christian thinkers that equally as intelligent. It's not about intelligence, but it's just about how you answer the ultimate questions determines your worldview. And you can see that in thinkers like Francis Schaeffer, C.S. Lewis, even one of our favorites, Timothy Keller, who recently passed away. Just great minds, but they come to a completely different conclusion about the world and how to answer all the other questions based on the question of God.
What are some of the ultimate questions?
I think the ultimate questions are God, ? Truth, ? How to find truth? How do you know what you know? Which is a subcategory of philosophy called epistemology, the study of knowledge or the study of how you know what you know, is an ultimate question. Metaphysical questions, what's behind everything? Some of the same questions that you see the ancient Greeks asked.
Plug for your book.
Boom.
I feel like a certain percentage of what you're saying, I wish I had more context to. Am I going to find that context in your book?
I should hope so. Or if not in the ones on the Greeks, it'll be in the next 20.
How exciting. Good for you.
I do have more questions for you. And I would like to know if you would do me the pleasure of coming onto my show again sometime in the future, near future.
Sure. I want to be, since I was the first, I want to be on your 10th. I want to be on your 100th. But I want to be on your 50th too.
You're going to be on like way more than that. Let's just be real.
Awesome.
So long as you bring the content.
Awesome.
And the books.
Okay.
I'm excited about your books. I've looked at them. I've read some of them. And I can't wait to see how you're gonna.
They're short. They're kids' books. Read them.
I can't wait to see who's gonna pick these up and your publishing process. It's gonna be a lot of fun to watch. And then we're gonna look back on this episode. We're gonna remember that we had, up to where you're at with this development. I'm just excited to see the reach it's gonna have. Yeah, I think it's a great concept. I'm really excited for you.
Thank you, sweetie.
Congrats.
Now I have
a couple questions. Every guest on my show, I will ask them a couple questions at the end of the show. And so, question number 1 is, what is your favorite word?
Is that what's his name asked on the Actors Studio thing?
Here we go.
Is that what he asked?
We're going way back.
Is that what he asked?
So they say that every piece of art is always modeled after something experienced or some other sort of art that's been kind of just you've been exposed to, right?
Sure.
So I would argue that back in the day when I had a little toddler, my daughter is now 13, she's a little girl, raising her, I would watch a lot of Actors Studio.
So is the answer to my question yes?
Admission. Every good piece of art has to be modeled in some other form. Okay, so the answer is yes.
Now, the question is, what's my favorite word?
What is your favorite word?
Man.
He said, what is your favorite curse word? I'm not going to ask you that.
He did say that.
He did say that.
Okay. Yeah, no.
And you know what? It still gives you something about the person that you're interviewing. So I'm just going to say, what's your favorite word? I know that's a very hard one because there's amazing words out there.
There are, and this isn't my favorite, but one that I've been using too much lately, I think I only used it once here with you, is boom.
All right, and question number 2. I reserve the right, by the way, as I continue doing these podcasts, to change my questions, but let's just start with this one for now.
Your show.
AI or original work? Only one or the other?
So Allen Iverson was a fantastic basketball player. Oh, you mean artificial intelligence?
Mm-hmm.
Just kidding.
What were you referring to?
The real AI.
What's the real AI?
Allen Iverson.
Who is that?
The answer. You're gonna have to Google it later.
Who is that?
AI or
Getting my computer
real
Google.
deal. How can you not answer real deal? Your question was without context, though, right? You just said what?
It's just one or the other.
One or the other. Yeah, the real deal. With the advent of artificial intelligence, things can be a lot easier, but ultimately, I want the real deal. Whether it's art, whether it's writing, whether it's music, I want the real deal. People make that joke that he's the original AI. I'm sure there's a meme.
I have to look it up now. Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time, because I know you're busy. So I appreciate you.
Boom.
All right, so I have a little clip of a kid who actually read a piece. Did he read a whole book?
I think so. Dailies.
Okay, so let's see what he has to say.
I think you described really well how, Thales thought about the world and a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, you described it really well. I think that was great.
You said you liked how there were when there were big words.
Yeah, I think maybe a littler kid could read that maybe with a little more ease because there were pronunciation guides above the larger words.
Yeah. I think it's for your age range is what he's thinking. So does it feel like your kids your age or maybe even a little older would be able to totally understand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Did you like the drawings? Were those helpful? Yeah. Yeah. You like this?
George help.
That's good. Anything?
That is adorable. It brings me a lot of joy. That was awesome.
And again, thank you so much for spending your time with me.
Thank you.